Morning, everyone. We're on this beautiful fall day. I mean, who could ask for better weather than what we have? Now, the weather is, I think, fall's here to stay. It was a pretty good weekend for Oregon football, though. You got to give it to that. I mean, Oregon and Oregon State, they both won by like 30 points yesterday, so that's a good thing. This morning, I just want to add to what Cass was saying. If you have never been a part of a small group, everything we do up here at Suburban is designed to help people encounter Jesus and become ever more fully alive in Him. And we really believe that one of the main ways that God can do that is through the relationships that He gives us with others here in the church, the way that we can connect with each other here. And that can be part of a formal small group as part of the church's ministry, or it could be something as informal as just having some friends that you connect with on a regular basis to share about what's going on in your life and what God is doing in you and through you. So if you think that's something that could really help you thrive and move forward with God, really would encourage you to have a conversation with Cass about getting involved in a group. As fall is sort of ramping up, we're launching some new groups. You can sign up for those in a couple of different ways. The back of the seat backs are these little small group cards. You can use one of those, fill it out, express your interest there, and you can drop it off in the Welcome Center as you go. Or she mentioned, I think actually she mentioned in the video, click the link below. That's because that video is something that we've hosted on our new website. We rolled out a new website this week and would encourage you when you get a chance to go and kind of look at that. You can go to the adult page and boy, that sounds bad when you're talking about websites. Sorry. No. You can go to the page for adult ministries, which is totally different. Anyway, there's a small group page with an interest form there, or there's a place where you can explore the 3 C's, right? We talk a lot about how we want people to grow in their relationship with Christ, the church, and the community. You actually find that video there and other videos that highlight some of what it is that we do as a church, and there's a form you can fill out there to do that. Speaking of website, though, there were some bumps in the road as we were rolling that out this week, and because of that, there were a number of days when the website was down and when the church's email was down as well. So just so you know, if you emailed the church this week and nobody got you back, we were really not trying to ignore you. So I just encourage you can go ahead and send that back in. The things are up and running now. And in fact, when we think about events, the one event that I think really was disadvantaged by that is this Women's Life Together event. It's kind of their kickoff event for the fall. It's happening tonight. Last week, we were like, you can find out more on the website and email the office to sign up. And then we kind of dropped the ball there. So this event is still going on. It was going to be an outdoor event, but because of the weather, we're moving it indoors. It's here at the church at 6 tonight. It is not too late to sign up. So if you're interested, you can sign up by just texting to this number here and just say, hey, I'm coming. Or as you go out today, you can go out right to the right of the door there in sort of the information center. There's a place where you can sign up as well. And that's just so that we can get a head count, make sure there's enough food for everybody as you get there. So, all right? Okay. So this fall, we're starting the sermons off by spending about 2 months working together through the book of Genesis. If you weren't here last week, we kicked this off, and I would encourage you to maybe take some time and go back. You can actually go to the website, find the sermons there. You can listen to it or watch it to get up to speed. But we're going to continue on this morning by looking together at, I think, what is one of the most horrifying passages in the entire Bible. It's found in Genesis chapter 22, and if it would help you for any reason, there's some red Bibles in those seats in front of you. You can grab one of those and turn to that page number that's there, because I'd love for us to be able to read this for ourselves. But as you're turning there, let me kind of sort of set the stage for you. Now, the book of Genesis is all about beginnings. It tells the beginning of the story of God's work in the world. And in the beginning, God created it all. And He created humanity to live in a right relationship with Him and with each other and with the created world around them. And He sets this in motion, and everything is great. And the only thing that humans have to do to keep this moving forward is to just trust God. To trust that His ways were best, that His instructions for living were in fact best. And they knock it out of the park for 2 whole chapters. And then in chapter 3, they make this fateful decision to go their own way, to decide that they're going to define for themselves what is right and wrong, and to not trust God. And when that happens, that the consequences are just disastrous. It spills out, and all these right relationships that we were created for, they all get broken. And even to this day, when we look at our world and the relationships around, we still see the effects of that brokenness between people and God, between people and each other, between people in this beautiful world that God created. And in the first story, it is the question of the book of Genesis. The question that Genesis comes back to over is this. It says, are people going to trust God? Or are we going to decide that we know better? Are we going to do what seems right in our own eyes? That's sort of the question that you see right there in chapter 3. And it's a question that gets revisited time and time again as we go through this book. But what I think is so amazing about this book is, so right there in chapter 3, humanity breaks faith with God, and even in the moment when God is laying out what the consequences of that decision is going to be, he's also sort of planting the seeds of our rescue in mind. And he makes this promise to them. He says, one day, this seed of a woman, the offspring of a woman is going to come, and that person will crush evil under their heel, will just crush the head of evil once and for all. So all throughout the book, as you're reading, you meet characters and you think, well, is this the one? Is this the person who was promised? Is this what it's going to be? And time again in chapters 4 through 11, we meet people who. And then God's rescue story takes this amazing step forward in chapter 4. And I am going to work through you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your family. I'm going to bless all the nations of the world through you. In fact, it's going to be one of your descendants who will be this offspring of the woman through whom I'm just going to put this all back together. And Abraham, what God calls him to do, he leaves everything that he knows and he steps out and sort of the story is in motion. But Abraham, it turns out, like a faithlessness at times. So he and his wife Sarah, when there's this promise that God is going to give them a baby, when God is coming through in that promise, this time, sleep with him. And that's the thing, and we all get this idea over and over again. When people trust God, good things happen. When they don't trust God, when they do what's right in their own eyes, things start to fall apart. So that's Abraham. But one of the big things that I think we saw last week is that even when Abraham was not faithful, God is faithful. God is 100% committed to keeping his promise to Abraham to bring him, to give him this son. And at the very beginning of chapter 1, like right where we're about to pick up, God comes through on that promise. It says this: "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham at the very time God had promised him." Abraham promise. And when you stop and think about it, it's a pretty miraculous occurrence because Abraham is 100 years old at this point and his wife Sarah is 90. But he's come through on the promise. Now think about what that means. Abraham got that initial promise that God was going to give him a boy when he was 75 years old. Well, now he's 100, right? So there have been 65 without that news, and now she's 90. Here this morning, and your experience in life or your worldview makes it really hard for you to believe this story, to believe that a 90-year-old woman could have a baby. I want you to know that I understand that. I mean, think about it. How often in our daily experiences and lives do we see 90-year-olds give birth? And not very often. It is miraculous. But it's not outside the realm of possibility given what Christians believe. I mean, Christians are people who believe that the central event of human history is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? That God literally brought a dead man back to life. And we certainly do, and there's great historical evidence that points to that. If we believe that God can bring a dead man back to life, God helping a 90-year-old woman have a baby seems like kind of a small-scale miracle compared to that one. But even if your worldview makes you kind of struggle with that, this is what I want you to do. I want you to lay those doubts to the side for a second. And just try and enter this story, what it is that Abraham and Sarah are experiencing. Because they've been waiting a long time for this promise to be delivered on. And we get that, right? Because we've all had experiences in life where we have had to wait for things. And I don't know about you all, but I don't particularly like waiting for things. None of us do. Just an example, a couple weeks ago, we ordered a new phone for our son because the old one wasn't cutting it anymore. So Verizon sending it UPS 2-day air. I bet over the course of there were 15 times we track online and see where that package is. Right? Because the agony of waiting 2 days to get this phone until the joy you can imagine when it finally arrived. Well, think about that. That was just a phone. But think about it, what we feel when there's a promise and we've got to wait for and something that's more weighty. Think about time, right? Between applying for college and hearing back you've been accepted. Think about that season of waiting. When you get the news that the cancer is gone, but in 6 months, you have to go back for an MRI to see if it's returned. Right? Think about that kind of waiting. Or think about the experience that parents have, right, when you see your baby on the ultrasound for the first time, but then you got to wait until you can hold that little girl in your arms. Or for me, in a very personal example, it was between when I asked Martha to marry me, and there was this long pause as she kind of envisioned and finally said yes. No, but none of us, we don't like to wait. But think about seasons where you've had to wait, and then when that promise gets delivered on, think about the joy that you feel and how that can just carry you for a while. Right? That's what Abraham and Sarah are feeling, but times like a bajillion, because this never should have happened, but they've got this boy, and they're going through life, and they watch him grow, and he brings them so much joy. Now imagine how you're feeling. You've got all that going on, and then imagine Abraham's shoes at the beginning of the next chapter, and you hear God say this to you. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, I want you to take your son, your only son, the son that you love, Isaac, and go to the region, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. Now, if you read God's command for Abraham to kill his boy, and the first thing that is, I am right there. I mean, you read this and you think, wait a minute, wait, this is in the Bible? How does this loving God, this God who's a good, good father, we sing that song here times, how does that work with that? Or you even just think about the sort of the logic of the story. God has promised that he is going to bless the whole world through the kids that Isaac has. It is really hard to come through on that promise if Isaac gets killed when he's a little boy before he has any kids. But there it is, right? In black and white. Right there in this text that we absolutely believe is inspired by God to teach us about him and to teach us about us. So what do you do with a text like this? I mean, it should surprise any of us that this text over the centuries has generated a lot of conversation. This story is known as the Akedah. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. But that's a Hebrew word that means the binding, right? It comes from the story where he binds his son and lays him on the altar and prepares to kill him. So for centuries, Jewish and Christian people have wrestled with this story and tried to say, okay, why is this here? What is this story trying to tell us about God or about ourselves? And this is a kind of story that has really derailed people's faith over the years. Like I remember once I was hearing somebody talk in the middle of their set, and they're talking about how they grew up in this very religious home. They love Jesus, follow Jesus. And there's a moment in their life when brother dies of cancer. And it's some part of that experience there. And their reflection, talk very explicitly about this text, reflecting on this text where the God of the universe would demand the death of a child. And she said all those things together were enough to just make her decide to walk away from this faith once and for all. Or imagine, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's just trying to figure out Christianity. What is Jesus? Do they believe them? And what do we think about this? And they say, you know what I'm going to do to learn more? I'm going to read the Bible for myself. Like, that's a great thing, right? We encourage people to read the Bible. We love the Bible up. You start on page 1. It only takes them about 19 pages to say, this God seems like a monster. Even if you read through the whole chapter and you really go through with him, he spares Isaac, it doesn't necessarily help all that much. Think about how the chapter starts. It says sometime later, God tested Abraham. Right? What kind of God would come up with a cruel test like that? I mean, think about what Abraham experienced as he went through this. Or put yourself, if you want to, in the shoes of Isaac, watching this as it's happening to him. Really, like, is this the kind of God that we want to get involved with? Those are the kind of questions that a text like this really bring up. So having said all that, this is what I want us to do. I want us to read through this story together and do the work that's involved in trying to understand it the way the original author wanted us to understand it, the way that God inspired them to write it down. And to do that, we actually have to start in chapter 21. Because you can't make sense of chapter 22, 21. And here's the thing. Remember, when we're reading through the text today, we've got chapter, those things all got added centuries later as a way to help people kind of find their story in chapter 20, an oral culture. And then immediately they would hear this story. And they just couldn't help but put those two things together so that by making a look at that, the author does the stuff that I read literature. That's what I studied. And I can just tell you that the craftsmanship that has gone into these stories, just the literary art, the way that God inspired these things to be put down. There is no other book out there like the Bible. There's just nothing like it. And there's really nothing else out there like the book of Genesis, where every detail, in every chapter, the author is putting something in that kind of points ahead to something that's going to come. Or everything that we read, a lot of times it's like a hyperlink on a website. It goes back to a story that we've already said. So we think about that and we bring them together in our mind and we understand them both a little bit more deeply by how they come together. And that's what's going on here. We'll see there, right? So let's go back to chapter 21 because they're intended to be read together. And we'll see kind of how they work to help us understand what's happening in 22. So we already read the beginning of 21. God comes through on his promise. Isaac is born. And we talked about the fact that there was already some tension between Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Hagar, the slave that they took advantage of so that she could have Ishmael. Well, now that a boy of her own, that tension just kind of skyrockets. It goes through the roof. It says, Isaac grew and was weaned, and on the day that Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, listen to this language, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in detail, right? Like she doesn't mention them by name. Instead, she only refers to Hagar by this term, that slave woman. that really kind of puts her in her place in the social status of the family. So she keeps going. It says, this matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Abraham loved his son Ishmael too. But God said to him, don't be so distressed about the boy and the slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So now that Sarah has a boy of her own, there's no point in keeping Hagar and Ishmael around. I mean, they were only plan B anyway, because it looked like God wasn't coming through his promise. But now that he has come through, they are disposable, right? They're essentially trash to Sarah. We just need to get them out of the way. That hurts Abraham because he does love his son. God says it's okay, right? He is the son of blessing. He's the one that this promise is going to go through. But I'm going to take care of him. He does what God says. He sends him off. It says, early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. And remember, Ishmael's probably a teenager at this time, so she puts her teenage son under there because she doesn't want to have to watch him die. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I can't watch him die. And as she sat, but God heard the boy crying. And the angel of the Lord called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard you there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God gave the boy a drink. And again, I just love some of the details that the author works in there. So you guys notice that, Hagar puts him under the bush and she goes away and starts crying. Well, apparently Ishmael is sobbing as well, because the text says that God hears the cries of the boy, and that Hebrew word lad, it's like this very endearing term. He hears the boy's cry and he shows up to save them. And he opens up Hagar's eyes, and she's this incredible gift, right? This well in the wilderness. So she's able to give her boy some drink. I mean, really, think about it. God provides life. He provides rescue for this mom's beloved son when there was nothing there. So keep that in mind, and we're going to look at chapter 22. So we already saw how chapter 22 started. It starts with this horrific command from God for Abraham to kill his boy. And it never actually says what Abraham, if he replies verbally. Instead, it just starts showing what he does, that he's committed to doing this. So it says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. So he said to his servants, stay, we will worship, and then we will have an offering, and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. Again, what an interesting detail that the author has put in there, right? What does Abraham choose himself? The fire and the knife. Why do you think he does that? I mean, do any of you let your kids play with knives or matches? No. I mean, it's just this amazing insight into the heart of Abraham and what he's thinking about, right? He's still a dad. He still doesn't want his boy to get hurt. He doesn't want him to carry things that might accidentally hurt him. Think about that. He is literally walking where he is going to execute his son. And in some part of his heart, he's still caring. You see this sort of tension in there. Keep going. It says, as the 2 of them went on together, Isaac, the boy, spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said. But where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And that line about God providing, that's going to be important. We'll come back to that. But you keep going, and at this point, it's almost like time slows down because of the way that the author is putting these details in there. It says, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac. That's where that Hebrew was from, the binding. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am. He replied, please, feel free to interrupt. Here I am. Don't lay a hand on the boy, he said. Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son from me, your only son. And there in the thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Now there's a lot going on in there, but what I want you to really stop and think about are some things these stories have in common, some of the parallels, some of the to make us tie these things together in our mind. Okay, so in chapter 14, early one morning, Abraham gets up and he takes food and water, things that are meant to sustain life, and he puts that on Hagar's shoulder. Chapter 22, early one morning, Abraham gets up, takes the wood that he is going to use to burn his life, and he puts it on Isaac's shoulder, right? You think about it, right? So Hagar ends up putting Ishmael under a bush because she doesn't want to watch him die. She leaves him there to die. In the next chapter, Abraham ends up finding the ram, the very thing that sort of spares his son's life, under a bush. The NIV doesn't translate that well. It's the same root word in Hebrew there. The author wants us to make that connection. In both of the stories, at this critical moment, right, the angel of the Lord shows up and interrupts, and he tells Hagar, don't be afraid. And he tells Abraham, now I know you fear the Lord. There's this connection there. Or you think about it, Hagar, it's like her eyes are open. She sees this well that's going to sustain life. And in the Hebrew in chapter 22, it says that Abraham lifts up his eyes and he sees the ram, the thing that is going to spare his son's life. So the author intentionally using all of these details as a way for the reader to say, hey, these things are meant to be read together as a pair. So if they go together as a pair, which I think hopefully I've convinced you of that, the real question that we've got, why? Why has the author put these two stories together? What is it that these stories are going to tell us? And I think the answer to that goes back to the very beginning of chapter 22 when it says that Abraham is doing this as a way to test Abraham. Because again, it all comes back to that question. The question is, are people going to trust God, or are people going to do what seems right in their own eyes? Get on here. Right? Abraham and Sarah, when they didn't trust God, when they decided to do what was right in their own eyes, right, they take sexual advantage of their slave, and it causes tremendous pain and damage to so many people. And over the course of these two chapters, they're being tested. Abraham's being tested because he has this demonstrated track record of not being faithful to God. And it's like in these chapters, God begins to just sort of peel away the things that Abraham has compromised his integrity to get. So in chapter 21, he says, that son that you kind of work behind the scenes to engineer for yourself, yeah, it's time to send him away, Abraham. So he loses one of the sons that he loves. And God puts him to this horrific test. And it's if he says, Abraham, you schemed, you hurt other people to get this son that you wanted, the son that I freely and miraculously give you. And if I do that, are you still going to trust me? Right? I know, Abraham, this does not make any sense, right? I have promised that I will bless the world through the kiss little bit. You trust that somehow I am, once again, are you going to do what is right in your own eyes? And that, when it sort of bringing it back to this idea of trust, the central question of the book of Genesis, is the only reason that I can figure out, it's the only way in my mind that I can make sense of contradiction in the story. The fact that here God's asking for a child sacrifice. The God that we follow hates child sacrifice, right? That was a practice in some of the other religions that were in the neighborhood of the day. But about a dozen different times in the Old Testament, God says explicitly, I do not want you to kill your children in my name. And again, yet here, that's what it's a test. Never in for that story. He's testing. I understand that. The story some, I do. I'm like, okay, God, I guess I understand this in a different way, but really? This just seems so extreme. And that's why I think this whole story, the fact that it makes sense, it really does fit with the book of Genesis when you view it through that central question that the book raises over. I think God uses this specific test at this critical time to forefront this question of trust. Really trust. It's such an important question to ask because everything that he's promising to do through Abraham and everything that he promises to give us new life in him, work through us to extend that blessing to the world, it all comes down to trusting God through us what he says he can do. And really, when you look at chapters 21 and 22, I think they are there to help us answer the question, can we trust God to provide? Because clearly what you see in both of those stories is that, yes, God can be trusted to provide. Right? He provides a well to keep Ishmael alive. He provides a ram so that Abraham doesn't have to sacrifice his son. Remember, as we were reading through chapter 22, I said, hey, pay attention to verse 8. We're going to come back to that, right? It says that God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. That's what's going on here. That's what this story is driving at. It's a story not so much about Abraham's faith as it is about God's trustworthiness to come through on the promise that he has given. And that is very much how the other early Christian tradition understood this. So for example, if you look at the letter of Hebrews, it's a first century document that we have as one of the books in the New Testament. At one point in there, the author of Hebrews talks about this story, this specific story, and talks about what Abraham was thinking, what his motivations were, and he puts it this way. He says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, right, that's this Genesis 22 story he's talking about, he offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. It's an interesting picture of what this guy's perspective was on what Abraham was thinking. He has such incredible faith and trust in God that he says, I guess even if I kill Isaac, God can bring him back to life so that he can fulfill that promise to bless the world through Isaac's descendants. And really, I think what you see in these chapters together is just example after example of God providing. Right? He provides rescue for Ishmael in the desert. He lifts up the eyes of Abraham to see this ram. And when Abraham does that, when he trusts God, even when it makes no sense to, when he says, okay, I'm not going to, God ends up giving his son back of rescue and life. And then one of the things that we see in there is that once Abraham has done that, when he's sort of put his trust and faith in God in this amazing way, God then repeats to him some of the very same promises that he gave him in Genesis chapter 12. It's like he reiterates that now that his faith has been demonstrated, his trust has been demonstrated. So he says this, he says, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. In a way, it all goes back to Genesis 3 and that promise that one day this offspring of the woman is going to come. Right? When the offspring of the woman really fears the Lord, really trusts that God could even do the miraculous and bring a beloved son back to life, that's when the blessings of the nations start to get released to the nations again. Right? That's a major step in restoring back together. To give up their beloved son for the sake of others. That is a pattern that we're going to see again in Genesis. Not important than that. That's something that we see as a geographical note. This Mount Moriah, this is not the only time that God tests someone in the body, this specific place. In 2 Samuel, David gets tested right here. Himself is tested here. Right? Most scholars look at this, they think that Mount on that hill with the temple complex in the city, that is where Jesus was in fact crucified, was somewhere on this Mount Moriah site. And in each of those things, right, God tests someone, right? Abraham is tested because through his life he has failed and failed and failed. David in 2 Samuel is tested by time. It's only when Jesus is tested in this place. And the Gospels do describe the suffering and the execution of Jesus as a form of a testing. He is all of us, right? He passes this in a way that none of us are able to do on our own. Do we really trust that God is the one who can provide the way back? Or is this something that we're going to have to endure on our own? And again, the Bible shows us just over and over again that we cannot do this on our own. Even the best of us, right? King David, Father Abraham, they don't pass the test pretty consistently. Verse 21, rescue. We rescue ourselves. So what does God do? He invites us to trust him, and he himself provides the way back to him. Right? As followers of Jesus, we believe it is only through accepting God's offer of grace, it is only through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ that we can ultimately be put back into this right relationship with God. We have to trust he can provide for us what we can't do for ourselves. And when we do that, when we take him and accept that, it's only then that we're filled with the power of the Holy Spirit and we actually have the ability to live the lives that he created us to live, have the ability to be the kind of people who live out those promises in Genesis 12, people who can share this message of God's love and his blessing with the world around us. So to end up, I just want to ask one question for all of us. Where do we see ourselves in this story? Right? What do we need to do with what we've heard today? You know, for some of us, maybe look at this story and we're kind of like Abraham. Some of those consequences of sins in the past, they're still knocking on the door. They're still tripping us up. And if that's the case, what do you need to do this week to invite God to come in and provide some hope and provide some healing there in a real way? But for most of us, I think what it really comes down to is just this question of trust. When you look at your life, whether it's the big thing, like the eternal fate of your soul, or maybe it's just smaller things that you see in life, I mean, are there areas in our areas, are we really trusting that to provide, or areas where we're not on this yet? Maybe I need to step out and just kind of take matters into my own hands. What I want us to do to close out our time together, the musicians are going to come up to do service. And if you would like an opportunity to speak with someone or put these things, you can head out those doors, take a right, follow what's going on. And God, it's been week getting ready for this sermon. Ever since I was a kid, I was age in this story the first time I read this, and it has troubled me ever since then. I mean, even now, Lord, after doing the work to prepare for the sermon and to preach it, I feel like I understand more of who you are and what you're calling us to do in this story, and yet, God, I'm still just as troubled that it's in there. God, we may not be asked that question where the stakes are as high as Abraham had or where the terms are as stark as what he had. We have little opportunity to either exercise our trust and belief that you know best. No, I'm going to hold on to that. I got something, I'm going to take care of that on my own. Thanks, but no thanks, God. So Lord, as we have time to reflect on what come, that you would help us know what is our next right step in following you. Because you lead us step by step, Lord, and then once you do that, once it's clear what it is that we're supposed